For much of modern history, the global economy has revolved around a single axis, a currency whose value, stability, and reach have shaped the trade flows, alliances, and even the sovereignty of nations. This currency has been hailed as the bedrock of stability by those who control it, and quietly cursed by those whose development and independence it has constrained. For decades, African nations have traded in markets where the rules were written far away, where transactions were settled in a money they did not issue, and where economic lifelines could be cut by political decisions in foreign capitals. The system has been so deeply entrenched that many have considered it unchangeable. But history has never been kind to illusions of permanence, and today there is a growing sense that the global order of finance may be approaching one of its great turning points. The introduction of China's Africa Payment Plan is more than just another economic initiative. It is the product of shifting tides in global power, the result of decades of quiet preparation, and the reflection of a world increasingly unwilling to accept financial domination by a single currency. For African nations, it is presented as a doorway into a new era of trade, where transactions can be conducted in local currencies or in China's yuan, sidestepping the dollar entirely. For those who have spent lifetimes under the weight of currency dependence, it sounds like the unlocking of a long-sealed gate. To understand why this development matters, one must look at the machinery of control that has long been disguised as economic necessity. When African nations sell oil, gold, cocoa, cobalt, or rare earth minerals, the payment typically passes through international banking systems priced in dollars. This process demands conversion fees, exposes trade to fluctuations in a foreign currency's value, and places every transaction under the shadow of institutions that can freeze, delay, or block payments entirely. Over time, this has created an environment where African economies are not only vulnerable to global market shifts, but also to the political will of those who oversee the dollar system. The new payment plan challenges that. If a Kenyan farmer exports tea to China, or if a Nigerian company sells oil to an Asian buyer, the transaction could now bypass the dollar altogether. Payments could be made directly in yuan, or settled in local African currencies, with far lower costs, and without the risk of a political dispute in Washington halting the trade. This might seem like a small change, but in the complex web of global finance, the smallest change in payment routes can have seismic consequences. It can mean billions of dollars in savings over time. It can mean the difference between trade continuing during a diplomatic disagreement or collapsing under sanctions. It can mean sovereignty in a field where sovereignty has been rare. But every opportunity carries a shadow. Those who view the dollar's dominance as a guarantor of order see this move as a threat to global stability. They warn that replacing the dollar with another dominant currency could simply trade one form of dependency for another. They point to China's growing investments in African infrastructure, its role as a major creditor to many African governments, and the possibility that payment systems under its influence could also be wielded as tools of leverage. Such warnings must not be dismissed lightly. The road to true independence is not paved by switching the language of dependence, it is built by dismantling dependence entirely. This is where the challenge for African nations becomes sharper. The temptation in moments of change is to rush into the arms of the new, simply because it is not the old. But the deeper question is whether this shift will be used as leverage to negotiate fairer trade terms, to strengthen African currencies, to invest in domestic banking capacity, and to demand that no single foreign power, whether Western or Eastern, holds the keys to Africa's economic life. The greatest risk would be to see this moment as liberation, when it is merely a rearrangement of the chains. Yet the timing of this initiative is no accident. Around the world, nations are experimenting with alternative trade arrangements. The rise of regional payment systems in Asia, Latin America's talk of shared currency mechanisms, and the push for gold-backed or commodity-backed settlements all point to the same reality. The monopoly of one currency over global trade is weakening. The Africa Payment Plan is part of this momentum, and the more nations that take part, the faster the momentum grows. For the dollar, the challenge is not just the yuan's rise, but the cumulative effect of many small exits from its system. Every trade conducted outside the dollar weakens its central role just a little. Over years, this erosion could reach a point where the dollar is no longer the unquestioned king of global finance. That moment would reshape alliances, rewrite trade agreements, and upend the strategic leverage the United States has enjoyed for generations. And it would begin in places far from the skyscrapers of New York, or the corridors of Washington, in ports, markets, and digital payment systems across Africa. Some will argue that such changes are inevitable, part of the natural cycle of economic history where no empire lasts forever. Others will fight to maintain the current system at any cost, seeing in it not just financial stability, but a way to enforce political and military dominance. And in the middle of this clash are the African nations, standing at a crossroads where the choices they make in the next decade could shape their economic destiny for centuries to come. The power of the Africa Payment Plan lies in its symbolism as much as in its mechanics. It sends a message that African trade need not be a tributary flowing through distant capitals. It says that partnerships can be forged directly, without intermediaries who take more than they give. It invites African leaders to think beyond survival economics and into the realm of strategic economic independence, but it also demands discipline, unity, and vision, qualities that have been undermined over decades of external interference and internal division. One of the most profound consequences of adopting alternative payment systems is the political space it creates. A nation that controls its trade settlements is less vulnerable to sanctions. A nation that can settle its debts without touching a foreign currency is harder to coerce. A nation whose banking systems are not wired into the surveillance architecture of a global hegemon can act more freely in its foreign policy. This is why currency independence is not a dry technical matter. It is a matter of sovereignty in its purest form. The road ahead will be difficult. The dollar system is deeply entrenched, supported not just by the United States but by global corporations, financial markets, and institutional inertia. The infrastructure for yuan-based payments in Africa is still developing, and the willingness of African businesses to adopt it will depend on factors such as exchange stability, liquidity, and trust in the system. It will take time before such a plan can scale to challenge the dominance of the dollar. But if history has taught us anything, it is that systems of control are most vulnerable at the moment they seem unshakable. For Africa, the most dangerous outcome would be to replace one external master with another. The opportunity lies in using this shift as a bargaining chip to strengthen continental integration, to expand the role of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and to invest in local payment technologies that reduce dependency on any single partner. China's role can be significant in this transformation, but it must be approached as a partner, not as a patron. The dollar's supremacy has been built not only on economic strength, but on political and military dominance. That is why challenges to it are often met with more than economic countermeasures. Nations that have tried to bypass the dollar have often faced pressure, destabilization, and in some cases direct conflict. The question now is whether the growing number of countries seeking alternatives can provide each other with enough mutual support to withstand such pushback. Africa's role in this is critical. With its vast resources, young population, and strategic location, the continent is not just another market, it is a pivot point in the rebalancing of the global economy. The Africa Payment Plan may not be the final blow to dollar dominance, but it could be one of the most important cracks in its foundation. If implemented wisely, it can open the door to a more multipolar financial world, where no single nation can dictate the terms of trade for all others. If implemented carelessly, it could simply shift the chains from one set of hands to another. The difference will depend on leadership, foresight, and the refusal to settle for half freedom. In the years ahead, this initiative will face resistance, setbacks, and attempts at sabotage, but it will also inspire imitation, adaptation, and expansion. The idea that Africa can trade on its own terms, with partners of its choosing, is not one that will easily be put back in the box. It speaks to a deeper truth, that economic sovereignty is inseparable from political sovereignty, and that without it, nations are forever negotiating from a position of weakness. Whether this payment plan becomes the game changer it promises to be, will depend not just on China's commitment, but on Africa's ability to seize the moment. It will require investment in local financial systems, the building of trust between trading partners, and the courage to face down those who benefit from the current order. The stakes are nothing less than the freedom to chart one's own economic destiny. And in a world where currency has long been the invisible chain, breaking that chain may be the most revolutionary act of all. Bypassing the dollar, China's Africa Payment Plan allows trade settlements directly in yuan or local African currencies, reducing dependence on the US dollar and cutting transaction costs. Economic sovereignty, controlling payment systems strengthens Africa's political independence, reduces vulnerability to sanctions, and prevents foreign powers from freezing or blocking transactions. Opportunity versus new dependence. While it could be a step toward freedom, Africa must avoid simply replacing dollar dependency with yuan dependency. Global financial shift. This move is part of a larger trend toward multipolar finance, where no single currency dominates, challenging the US-led global financial order. Africa's strategic role. With resources, population, and location, Africa is central to shaping a new global economic balance. Success depends on unity, strong local financial systems, and fair partnerships. I can also give you a short, sharp, one-line version of each point for quick delivery, if you want this to be punchier for a speech excerpt. For decades, the global economy has been structured in a way that forces nations, especially those in Africa, to trade and settle their transactions through the US dollar, regardless of whether their trade partners are American. This system has not only been inefficient, but has also given one nation disproportionate control over global commerce. Every time two countries trade, they must often convert their currencies to dollars first, paying unnecessary fees and losing value in the process. More dangerously, this reliance creates a financial chokehold where the threat of sanctions or restrictions can instantly cripple an economy. The dollar has been more than a currency, it has been a tool of geopolitical power, used to influence, control, and in some cases punish independent nations that refuse to follow certain agendas. Bypassing the dollar is more than an economic decision, it is an act of reclaiming sovereignty. When African nations conduct trade directly in their own currencies or in the currencies of trusted partners, they strip away the middleman and keep wealth circulating within their economies. This means fewer foreign transaction costs, less vulnerability to external manipulation, and greater resilience in times of political or economic tension. It is not about rejecting a specific currency out of hostility. It is about creating a world where no single currency holds others hostage. The movement away from the dollar also signals a major shift in the global financial order. Alternative payment systems, regional trade settlements, and currency swaps are becoming more common, reducing the monopoly of one currency over international trade. For Africa, this is a chance to engage in commerce on fairer terms, to form partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than dependency. However, the transition must be managed with care. Simply replacing the dollar with another foreign currency without strengthening domestic economies would only trade one dependency for another. True independence means African nations must build robust local financial systems, encourage intra-African trade, and invest in digital payment technologies that ensure transparency and security. By controlling the way they trade, they also control the direction of their future. The choice to bypass the dollar is in essence the choice to shape their own destiny, to no longer be subject to the financial dictates of distant powers, and to stand firmly in a world moving toward a more balanced and multipolar economic reality. This is more than finance, it is freedom in motion. Economic sovereignty is the foundation upon which true independence is built. Without control over its own economic systems, a nation remains vulnerable to external influence, no matter how strong its political institutions may appear. Throughout history, many countries have found themselves politically free but economically chained, unable to make decisions that truly serve their people because their economies are tied to foreign interests, debt obligations, or global systems designed to benefit others at their expense. This lack of control shapes everything, from the price of basic goods to the ability to invest in infrastructure and public welfare. Gaining economic sovereignty requires more than simply rejecting external control. It demands building the capacity to produce, trade, and innovate internally. A country must develop industries that meet its own needs, manage its natural resources in a way that benefits its people, and ensure that wealth generated within its borders stays there. Too often, the wealth of a nation flows outward, with raw materials exported cheaply and finished products imported at high costs. This imbalance not only drains resources but also stifles development, keeping economies dependent and unable to compete on equal terms. Breaking this cycle involves strategic planning, education, and investment. Local industries must be supported through policies that encourage production, protect against unfair competition, and promote innovation. Trade should be structured to prioritize regional and continental partners, creating economic networks that strengthen collective resilience. Financial systems must be independent, ensuring that the nation's economy is not at the mercy of foreign banks or international institutions that impose conditions designed to serve their own interests. Economic sovereignty also means controlling currency, taxation, and public spending without outside interference. It means having the power to decide what industries to prioritize, how to use natural resources, and where to direct public investments. It is about ensuring that economic decisions are made with the welfare of citizens as the central priority, not the demands of global markets or the pressures of foreign governments. When a nation achieves this level of independence, it is no longer merely a participant in the global economy, it becomes a player that sets its own terms. Economic sovereignty transforms a country from a subject of global forces into a shaper of its own destiny, creating the foundation for lasting prosperity, dignity, and self-determination. Without it, political freedom remains incomplete. Every new economic or political shift presents both promise and peril. The arrival of new trade partners, financial systems, or geopolitical alliances can seem like a gateway to prosperity, offering a chance to break free from long-standing constraints. For many nations, this moment feels like a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reshape their destinies, reclaim resources, and establish fairer terms of engagement. The prospect of better trade deals, infrastructure investment, and financial independence inspires hope, particularly for countries that have endured decades of economic exploitation under one dominant system. Yet with every opportunity comes the danger of replacing one form of control with another. History is filled with examples of nations that, in seeking liberation from one power, fell under the influence of another, often just as restrictive, if not more so. New partnerships can carry hidden costs, debt traps, trade imbalances, or political strings attached that limit true sovereignty. Promises of development can mask the transfer of ownership over critical assets, leaving nations in a cycle of dependence that only changes the name of their overseer. The key challenge lies in navigating these opportunities with clear-eyed strategy. Not every offer of aid or investment is a step toward freedom. Sometimes it is the first step into a new kind of subjugation. Nations must ask, who truly benefits from this deal? What are the long-term consequences? Does this partnership strengthen our own capacity to produce, govern, and trade independently, or does it bind us to external approval and control? True opportunity empowers a country to stand on its own, even as it engages with global markets. It allows for the transfer of knowledge, the growth of domestic industries, and the building of infrastructure that remains under national ownership. It creates wealth that circulates within the nation, rather than flowing outward to foreign hands. New dependence, on the other hand, might deliver short-term gains, but at the expense of long-term freedom. The difference between the two often comes down to vigilance, unity, and negotiation strength. A nation must enter every agreement with a clear vision of its future, ensuring that each step forward is truly toward independence, not into another trap disguised as progress. The moment of choice is critical, for once dependence takes root, it can be as difficult to escape as the chains of the past. The world is witnessing a transformation in how money moves, how power is distributed, and how influence is exercised. For decades, the global financial system has been dominated by a select few currencies, institutions, and powers that have dictated the flow of trade, credit, and investment. This concentration of control has given certain nations disproportionate influence over the economies of others, shaping policies, determining access to capital, and even deciding who thrives and who struggles. But change is underway. Emerging economies, new technologies, and alternative financial systems are beginning to challenge the established order. Digital currencies, regional payment systems, and new trade agreements are eroding the absolute dominance of traditional financial centers. Nations are exploring ways to settle trade in their own currencies, bypassing long-standing intermediaries that have historically taken a share of every transaction. This shift is not merely about economics, it is about sovereignty, about the ability to make decisions free from the constraints of external control. It represents a desire to redistribute power from a few centralized hubs to a more diverse and multipolar system. Yet, as with any transformation, the path is fraught with risks. Those who benefit from the old order will not relinquish their influence easily. They may employ economic pressure, political maneuvering, and even outright destabilization to protect their position. Moreover, the new systems being built are not immune to flaws. They could replicate the same inequalities and dependencies if they are not designed with fairness, transparency, and mutual respect at their core. This moment in history demands vision and cooperation. If the emerging order is to be truly different, it must be built on principles that empower nations to control their own resources, foster innovation, and trade on equitable terms. The shift must also account for the interconnected nature of the modern economy, recognizing that isolation is rarely a viable path, and that collaboration among equals can create stability and prosperity. The stakes could not be higher. A successful transformation could lead to a world where no single power dictates the economic fate of others, where the prosperity of one region does not come at the expense of another. But if this moment is mishandled, it could simply replace one form of dominance with another. The global financial shift is inevitable. The question is whether it will bring freedom or just a new face to control. Africa's position in the evolving global order is no longer peripheral. It is central to some of the most critical economic and political transformations of our time. The continent is rich in resources that fuel industries around the world, from the rare minerals essential for renewable energy technologies to the agricultural output that sustains millions. Beyond resources, Africa is home to a young, rapidly growing population, representing both an immense labor force and a vast consumer market. These attributes give it unmatched potential to shape the future of global trade, finance, and geopolitics. Yet for much of modern history, Africa's wealth has been extracted rather than leveraged for the benefit of its own people. Foreign powers have dictated the terms of engagement, setting prices, controlling supply chains, and ensuring that the greatest profits are reaped outside the continent. This imbalance has hindered industrialization, limited economic independence, and left many nations vulnerable to the shifts and shocks of distant economies. Today, however, a new era of strategic positioning is emerging, one in which Africa has the opportunity to renegotiate its place in the global system. The rise of alternative trading blocs, regional payment systems, and South-South cooperation offers African nations tools to bypass traditional gatekeepers. Partnerships are being formed based on mutual benefit rather than dependency, with a growing emphasis on processing resources locally, investing in infrastructure, and expanding intra-African trade. The African Continental Free Trade Area, for instance, holds the promise of creating one of the largest unified markets in the world, strengthening bargaining power on the international stage. But strategic advantage comes with responsibility. To fully realize its potential, Africa must invest in education, technology, and sustainable industries that can generate long-term prosperity. It must also guard against repeating the mistakes of the past, where short-term gains for a few were prioritized over long-term benefits for the many. The unity of African nations, coupled with a clear vision for shared development, will be essential in preventing outside forces from playing them against one another for strategic advantage. As the world's economic balance shifts, Africa has the rare chance to move from being a passive participant to an active architect of global change. By asserting control over its resources, shaping its trade relationships, and fostering innovation, the continent can become a decisive force in creating a more balanced, equitable, and multipolar world order, one where its strategic role is not only recognized but respected.